Thanks so much. We had some technical difficulties earlier. Hopefully, I'll have some slides. Great. It is so good to be here, and thank you to Angie and Emily and the whole team that put this together. This house is awesome, and there's so much cool stuff that we're going to talk about today, so I'm excited to bring you in. I prepared a 20-minute talk that I wanted to give you really a sense of the types of ways we are thinking at the Starling Lab and to bring you into our approach to thinking about blockchains and decentralized communities. The Starling Lab, for those of you who don't know, is based at Stanford and at USC, and we're using Web3 technologies to advance human rights in three domains: history, law, and journalism. And we work with an array of different affiliates to find ways to think of innovating so that as we think about Web3 as a solution, we can do it with a methodology so it's even-handed. We're not getting too excited about the hype. We're also not nihilistic about all the challenges that are there. And when you look at these areas that we focus on, the table stakes are really high, right? We're dealing with issues around trust, fake news, authenticity online. And because of that, we have to think about the people that we are affecting with our work. And so that's what I want to talk to you today. This is actually our first talk about NFTs as a lab. And I thought about, well, where would we start? And today is a technical day, so I want to make sure that we cover some of the technical challenges that are there. We have tons of engineers that we work with. But I want to give you a sense of the ways in which we try to encourage our engineers to think about the solutions that they're developing. So that's really the theme of my talk, is that we can get into the technical details, but I want to mostly inspire you as engineers to think about the responsibilities that you have when you're deploying this technology. All right, so I'm going to split this up into three parts, so follow me. The first is, let's go deep into the criticisms, because if we can't face those, we're never going to get through to the actual challenge, solutions that we want. And then I want to talk a little bit about values and the way forward with NFTs. All right, so let's begin with the criticism. Brace yourselves, this is not going to be easy. All right, we all saw an incredible 2021 where NFTs surged. Look at these numbers, it's insane. All right, you don't think about growth in this way. We're talking about tens of thousands of %, right? And that is exciting. And it surged a lot of money into the space, and with that, there were ripple effects. So now you had not just NFTs, but actually the larger crypto community started to enjoy all the benefits that happened with this new way of interfacing with Web3. So the thesis is basically that if NFTs succeed, they might be actually the very first way that most people have a token, and it might be the way that we actually start to change the internet itself, right? That's the idea. When we think about Web3, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of hype, but actually it's needed, right? We have a problem right now with the internet, and that some of those problems can be addressed with cryptographic tokens. So that, in a sense, that's the exciting thing that happened, is that it wasn't just about a bunch of people making money, it was that we were pushing back against something, right? And just as soon as all of the excitement happened, the backlash hit it. So towards the end of the year, you started to get these articles that popped up about the irrational exuberance of Web3, or Web 2.0's founder, Tim O'Reilly, said, yeah, you know, this whole Web3 story, it's a little early. And let me show you why some of the key things about this are broken or not necessarily on the path to success. And then you have Moxie penning his piece. Has anyone here read the piece? Okay, it's a good one to read, because he's a bit of a curmudgeon by his own admission, but what he does is he goes through systematically and says, look, I tried to use the tools, and I ran into some problems, like MetaMask, for instance, had issues in showing NFTs that I bought. That's a big problem, right? So there were more work. Like, Dave Peck had a very thorough analysis that they did in going through all of the different systemic challenges that are there. And I would say to you that on balance, these analyses are helpful. They're not all necessarily accurate. I want to be clear. I think there's reasonable debate to have. But I think what they were pointing to is a really important question, which is that as we are seeing problems with the Web3 ecosystem, and you're seeing technologies re-centralize or give undue power to some platforms, the question really is that re-centralization a feature or is it a bug? In other words, are Web3 technologies really trying to decentralize, and are they going to stick to that promise? That's a good question. I think we all need to continuously ask that question. And the responses, by the way, many of them were also very reasonable as well. And if you look at, like, for instance, the guys over at MetaMask said, look, Moxie, great, thank you for identifying a number of the challenges we have. By the way, we think you're wrong on this score and that score, and that's okay. And I won't get into all the details there. I think I will leave everyone to read these articles themselves. But the point is, this is progress. We want this. If you get defensive about it, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to improve. Because the issue was that if you go back to the beginning of Web 2, probably the biggest problem was this. We didn't ask questions. We thought Zuckerberg and co. were on the path to literally saving humanity. This was end of history headlines, right? Facebook was going to solve all sorts of problems with the world. And we didn't ask them, hey, what's going on here under the hood? What are you architecting? What is the strength of your technology? What are the weaknesses? On whole, we didn't ask enough questions. And so when I kind of compare basically like a decade's worth of activity, I'd say like, we don't necessarily have to make this same mistake again. As the dominant narrative, we can challenge and we can embrace that type of discussion. Okay, and then there's another form of criticism from folks like Dan Olson. Has anyone seen this piece? It's highly amusing. It's like 2 hours, 2-hour rant. It's like, gotta give the guy credit for that. He goes through a lot of the types of things that I think we in the NFT community are trying to address. Issues around power and this issue around how you actually create a more democratic infrastructure. Those are reasonable criticisms. And there's reasonable discussions about why Dan may not have it right. But he goes deeper. He says, well, the whole NFT proposition here is really built on hype, and when you get down to it, actually what's there under the hood is a bunch of fraud. Web3 is going great, just great. It's like an interesting website that like celebrates all of this. It seems to just get more and more excited the more problems there are. It's a pretty toxic dump of problems. And when you look at ultimately the apex of this argument, it basically says that, look, NFTs are actually just a way to kind of launder proceeds or get exits for other cryptocurrencies. Artists are essentially being used as kind of these suckers to cover up for all of the profiteering that happens with other cryptocurrencies. All right, so I'm going deep into all of the criticisms, right? And really what this is, if you add this up, is it says, okay, the primary product here with NFTs is hype. That's by design. And this is a form of community that's built on a very defensive form of toxic positivity here. Fascinating thesis. And what this boils down to is that basically the community is, in Dan's words, dull, unremarkable, and toxic. All right, that's really heavy stuff. And he goes deeper. And he says, if you think this is bad now, imagine what happens in success. What this will be is a system that financializes everything. It corporatizes everything. It takes things that shouldn't actually be monetized and it monetizes them. And it turns everyone into these kind of digital landlords, is what he calls it. And I think the way to really boil this into something that resonates is that he's fearful of this idea of betrayal, that we're trusting this community and these NFTs to do something, and we're very hopeful about it. And what he's saying is, be careful, because just like Web 2, you might be betrayed. Dorsey makes kind of a similar argument, although I think he comes from kind of a maxi point of view from Bitcoin, so take that for what it is. But it's the same sort of thing. He's saying, hey, don't let the Web3 community pull wool over your eyes. Like at the end of the day, they're backed by the same people that brought you Web 2. That's his argument. And if you follow that to its logical conclusion, you say, okay, wait, companies like Google, they had the same amount of euphoria and enthusiasm, right? And where did they end up? So what this idea is that we're in this cyclical pattern of history where things decentralize and then they centralize again. And that we're kind of condemned basically, to keep doing this over and over and over again with technology because that's the underlying business model. Or you can look at the cypherpunks. They're often mentioned as this kind of the people to admire. A lot of the crypto currency folks view them. This is a cover from 1993. It's pretty awesome. And these were fighting for privacy. And it wasn't necessarily an obvious position to take at the time. And in a sense, they claimed that this was the beginning of the internet, and this is the trajectory that we need to basically to understand and therefore complete. And NFTs provide you that agency and the protection that you want. And, in that corner, there's some interesting people that are aligned with this philosophy. This is politics, let's be very clear. There's a libertarian agenda that underpins all of this very clearly. And it has some interesting bedfellows, right? With maybe some of the people that I think we're all trying to say, wait, we're not so sure we actually want you to do this again. We don't want to promote this idea that monopolies are okay. Betrayal. That's the thesis. That's what they're warning. So you can get defensive, you can get concerned, or you can ask yourself, hey, is this happening? All right, so let's talk about some values. The way I see it is that actually this history is completely bunk because it didn't start in the early 90s. It didn't even start in the late 80s with the cryptographers. When I think about the trajectory of the internet today, probably the big bang moment of it from the real Web 1.0 is August 10th, 1995. It's an interesting day. Netscape, they have their IPO. They're worth about $6 billion within 8 months. And this is, I think, what the business model is and the trajectory that I think most people assume is the rise of successful tech startups, right? It goes back to that IPO. That's the big bang moment. I think this is an interesting day, though, for another reason. It's also the end of an era. So on the same day that Netscape has its IPO, I find it interesting and illuminating that it was actually the day that Jerry Garcia died. And the counterculture movement that Garcia stood for is really deeply rooted to not the web, but to the internet. And I want to cover with you some values that I think are so fascinating because maybe if we think a little bit about our history and we understand the types of things that we want to put into Web3, I think if we start a little earlier, it might be more inspiring and it might be even more durable. So someone like Doug Engelbart comes to mind. His task was to take basically the machines of the day, and he had the audacity to dream that this type of computer, and by the way, I'm not supposed to cross this line, but if you can see here, I can point. The computer is not there on the right, it's on the left. It's like this huge refrigerator. So Engelbart is to say, look, this is not the end state of this technology. And in fact, he created a framework in the late 50s that posited this idea that the computer needed to be personal, needed to be in your home, and that we could network them all together. Isn't that fascinating? That the idea of the internet was actually so tied to this idea of the personal computer. I had no idea. I thought the two were kind of separated out. No, if you really go back to the augmented intelligence framework, as it was productized, made physical into objects, it created things like the mouse and the screen. And those things were intimately tied to this idea that you needed a decentralized network that placed these powerful computers at the edges of the network. It wasn't for AT&T to decide and have all the intelligence, but you wanted the edges of the network to have it. Or you might look at someone like Stuart Brand. He took us into the bowels of Xerox PARC in this iconic article that was written in Rolling Stone in 1972. And there he introduced us to people that he called hackers. And they're really the first citizens or users of the internet. And they brought to that an ethic around what they felt was a need to keep things for users to continuously to be empowered. And folks like Alan Kay, who worked over at Xerox PARC, he developed the first personal computers that were actually small enough to actually be carried around. This is mid-70s, state-of-the-art technology, and they even had, by the way, it was 3D, had a lenticular screen on top of it. And you can see that Kay was an artist. And his idea of how he was going to create community and computing was really on this idea that you can create a straight line to say computing is about personal expression and that it's a new medium. It's not like the steam engine, it's like radio or television or books. Okay. And finally, there's my favorite, which is Fred Moore. He's the one that you don't hear about. Fred was an activist through and through, and he created this community called the Home Brew Club, which is a bunch of hobbyists that started to tinker around with all these toys. And different than Xerox PARC, which was very corporate, who derisively looked at all of this, they said, no, we're going to actually take these personal computers, make it something that you could assemble in your own home. And that, of course, created things like Apple Computer. And when you look at the first web server, Tim Berners-Lee's first node on the web, it's no accident that it was actually a personal computer. That's powerful. That's a very important lineage that we need to keep. So I take the history not from the early 90s and late 80s with the cryptographers, but I go much farther back. So let's talk about the future of what we can get there. We all know the problem because it didn't just end with a device like this that hobbyists made. Ironically enough, the Home Brew Club took place at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, which is on this street called Sand Hill Road. And so the very people that were the hobbyists and the ones who were creating things without any expectation actually of profit, ironically, they would be supported by the folks on the other side of the streets, the venture capitalists, and create what has been called the largest accumulation of wealth in human history. These are really important lessons to learn because essentially it means the technology doesn't guarantee any of this. The technology isn't deterministic. It's the people, it's the community. As Stuart Brand famously put, yeah, you're going to stay hungry and stay foolish, but he showed us that his generation, as he felt it through these values, proved that in cyberspace, you not just have agency or self-reliance, but he says that with that, it actually yields resilience. And where generosity leads, prosperity follows. Let me read that to you one more time. Where generosity leads, prosperity follows. I'd argue to you that those are the values that we might want to start with when we think about creating communities and NFTs. And that the implications are not about the transactions, they're about what's going to come next. What is the business model, the corporate form, the community? These are the table stakes of what we're creating. And so here are some things I'll throw out there as values that you might want to consider as you start to think about the communities you're building. One is about transparency. We need to introduce that because information asymmetry, which was really the game of Web 2, that's not a business model. That's a positive business model. It's an extractive business model. The second is that we need to think a little bit about collaboration. So as tribalism comes into play and we start to see these competing projects, we should think about integration as much as we can. And that there's this idea that if you do all of this, you actually get a regenerative form of economics. And that it doesn't actually have to be a winner-take-all. That with increased participation, you can get resiliency and adoption. You can get product quality as a part of continuous reinvestment into the system. And that maybe that when you have the most number of nodes that are there and the more diverse they are, if we take those proactive steps, we can get resilience. So that's, I think, how to address the cynics fundamentally, is to think about these values in their place in community. And the piece that I read that I really love, that I think is potentially the most important one, was a great piece by Tracy McClellan-Cotton. And she cited some really interesting statistics that said that when she looks at crypto communities, what she finds so remarkable is that it's younger and it's more diverse. 2/5 of crypto traders are not white, and 40% are women. Those are staggering numbers. And so we really need to think about Web3 in the most positive way, is that it might just be not an answer, but an opportunity to create these values and communities. And the criticism is welcome. The discussion is welcome. But hopefully we can also keep it optimistic as well. Thanks.